Welcome to the Trinity Broadcasting Network's production of Behold the Man. I'm Father Kim Dreisbach, the Executive Director of the Atlanta International Center for the Continuing Study and Exhibition of the Shroud of Turin. In the course of this program, our host, Kenneth Stevenson, co-author of Verdict on the Shroud, will take us through the areas of biblical studies, forensic pathology, art, and history to show us what all of these fields can tell us about what many consider to be God's love letter in linen to all mankind.
Hello, I'm Ken Stevenson, your host for Behold the Man. You know, being here in Atlanta brings back a lot of memories for me of my involvement with the Shroud of Turin Research Project and perhaps more importantly the exciting data that followed our short visit to Turin, Italy. I realize, however, though, that for many of you, the Shroud is still a mystery. And so perhaps the best place to begin would be with a description of the Shroud itself. It's a burial garment, a linen burial garment about 14.5 feet long and 3.5 feet wide. And it bears the imprint of a man's body, a man who has been crucified, scourged, crowned with thorns, whose side has been pierced, a man, in short, whose passion and death, as reflected on the cloth, mirrors what the Gospels tell us of Jesus' passion. Now, many of you have seen the image over my shoulder, which is in fact a negative. It isn't what the shroud looks like. The shroud image itself is a sepia image, rather faintly etched on the cloth, which when photographed reveals a positive on a negative slide. In fact, that positive image was what led to all of the scientific inquiry through the years on the shroud, beginning with Delage, Vignon, and Barbet, who from an agnostic position came to believe that the shroud was the authentic burial cloth of Jesus Christ. In fact, what the shroud does show us is quite fascinating. We learn, for example, that many of our Christian traditions that we have concerning the passion and death of Jesus are inaccurate, and yet what is reflected on the shroud about that passion and death is accurate to every detail. For example, the image that you see here is color-coded and digitized to reveal blood-stained areas on the face. One of the criticisms over the years of the shroud face image is that it is not disfigured enough. And yet I think you'll agree that this shows a man who's been disfigured beyond belief. As we go through the presentation today, I want you to consider two questions. One, is the shroud what it really appears to be, the burial cloth of Jesus Christ? And two, if it is, what indeed does it tell us about that very first Easter Sunday morning? What we're looking at now is actually a frontal image of the man of the shroud. In essence, then, only one half of the full length of the shroud's image. What I want to point out to you is the fact that the body image, the image of the man's body itself, beginning at the feet, working up the legs, thighs, hips, on up through the face, is actually in the center of the cloth. These two parallel lines, which would tend to attract your attention, and the triangular shaped patches on them are the results of a fire that occurred in 1532. And also you will see diamond shapes at various locations on the image that are also the result of that fire from water being thrown onto the cloth to douse the flames. But what you want to concentrate on then is the image right down the center of the cloth. What we can also see, and what we will do for the next few minutes, is to discuss each of the wounds in detail. Understand that the first scientists to study the shroud did not have the shroud itself to work with, but merely photographs such as you will see. But using those photographs, they were able to see the wound in the side, a wound in the wrist, blood flows on the arms where the blood trickled down, a wound in the feet, one in the scalp, and also blood flows in the hair and on various locations of the face. So then in each wound area, we will trace what would occur to the body of a man crucified and punished in this way and compare it with the gospel narratives of Jesus. When considering possible authenticity of the Shroud of Turin, the history is the weakest link in the chain of evidence. Documented history of the cloth begins in approximately 1357 in the possession of a French crusaders family by the name of Geoffroy de Charnay. Unfortunately, de Charnay was killed in a battle before he could give us any evidence about how he acquired the cloth or what its history was prior to his acquisition. His family could only say it was a spoil of war. Those who opposed the shroud were quick to point out that the face looks too similar, too much like the face of Jesus that has come down by artists over the centuries. And so obviously the likely conclusion was that the artist or forger, whoever he was, simply copied the traditional likeness. In fact, one French bishop, Diarchus, went so far as to say that he had actually found an artist who either claimed to have painted or copied the shroud likeness, depending on which translation you read. In fact, if we look at the face on the shroud and compare it with the face of Jesus in art down through the centuries, we get a striking similarity, not just in facial features, but the length of the hair, and even down to some rather unusual oddities that are apparent on the shroud and apparent on the faces of Christ in art down through the centuries. For example, a strange crease in the neck, a box in the center of the forehead, gaps in the beard in several locations, areas where the face is apparently bruised, or, as it shows up on art, different dimensions of the beard, rising more on one cheek than on the other. These things led early historians to consider the fact that the shroud may have in fact inspired the traditional likeness at some lost point in history. British historian Ian Wilson perhaps did the best job in reconstructing that history. Ian discovered that there was a record of an earlier miraculous image of the Savior, known by several names, which according to legend was brought to Edessa, a small town in Turkey now known as Urfa. It was brought there sometime in the 1st century by one of the disciples, variously known as Addai, Thaddeus, and possibly identified as Jude Thaddeus, the author of the New Testament epistle, Jude. At some time in the 6th century, most likely 525 AD, after a serious flood destroyed a major portion of the city, during reconstruction of a wall, the earlier cloth, known by then as the mandilion, was rediscovered in a niche over a wall of the city. It was brought back and put into a cathedral and became very famous. Artists from all over the world considered it the true likeness of Jesus and came and spent hours in front of the cloth trying to copy every tiny detail. Unfortunately, the mandilion appears to be only a face, and in fact, as the derivation of the word mandilion, veil or handkerchief, implies, this in fact led to the legend of Veronica's veil that came down in the church over the centuries. One of the problems then is, since the shroud is a full-length image, how do we justify an image that is only a face? Ian Wilson discovered that according to an early historical record concerning the mandilion, it was the image of Christ doubled in 4. Now, that made no sense until we doubled the shroud image in 4, and we discovered that the face becomes curiously disembodied, and because you cannot see the dead body, the passion, as so accurately reflected on the shroud, present there, it actually appears as if the eyes were open and staring. This then would replace the years from the 1st century until approximately the 6th century, when the likeness of Jesus became traditionalized all over the world. However, what happened to it from there? According to record, sometime in the 9th century, approximately 925 to 944, The Emperor of Constantinople, having heard about this miraculous cloth, sent an army to the city and laid siege to it. He returned rather triumphantly to the city and placed the cloth in a cathedral. From that time on, the records in Constantinople list both the, quote, Veronica's veil and the sidwan, or burial shroud, in which Jesus was wrapped. At some time in the 12th century, French crusaders came looking for the Holy Grail, where in 1203, one French crusader, Robert de Clary, writes that he had seen the burial sidwan in which the Lord was wrapped, on which you could see the naked imprints of the Savior's body. It was described as not consisting of earthly colors, seeming to be caused by sweat rather than pigment. It was described as a blurred image, difficult to make out. These seem to be fairly accurate descriptions of what we now know as the Shroud of Turin. Unfortunately, the Crusaders sacked the city and the cloth disappeared. Wilson wanted to know if there was some connection between these Crusaders and a group of French Crusaders known as the Knights Templar. The Knights Templar, very powerful, very wealthy, a very secretive organization, which later records indicate worshipped a mysterious male image. The king, wanting to get his hands on the Templar wealth, threw several of them into prison, gave them an opportunity to confess their idolatry. They refused. Their leaders were burned at the stake, and all of their possessions were confiscated. The only copy of the Templar image ever uncovered bared a striking similarity to the shroud image, both in color and facial features. This then would give us a historical trail of the shroud leaving Jerusalem, journeying with a disciple to the southern steppes of Turkey, where Edessa is, eventually winding in the area of Istanbul, where Constantinople was, and then being stolen by French Crusader knights, secreted away to Europe after the Crusades. This would explain the missing years of the shroud. It's interesting to note that Ian also found that one of those French Crusader knights burned for worshiping an idol was a gentleman by the name of Geoffrey de Charnay. We don't know at this point the relationship between the de Charnay burned at the stake and the de Charnay who was the first documented owner of the Shroud of Turin, but de Charnay is not a common French name. If Ian Wilson was right then, we've not only been able to reconstruct the shroud's whereabouts prior to 1357, but actually given a logical reason for it to be unknown throughout the last 2,000 years. To Christians, there are several significant areas about the shroud that raise questions. Not surprisingly, the scriptural evidence. One question that comes up is, wasn't the body washed? But we find as we study Jewish burial custom that in a case of a violent death, the blood would become sacred and the body would not be washed. We also find that in accordance with John's Gospel, there was already no time left to complete a normal burial ritual. And so this is why the women had to come Easter Sunday morning to the tomb to anoint the body after death. Perhaps one of the most frequently asked questions concerning the scriptural evidence is whether or not there was a face napkin. This is referred to again in John's Gospel, and some people seem to feel that this implies the shroud would have to be two cloths at least, and so therefore this would wipe out the possibility of the shroud's authenticity. Well, as John A.T. Robinson, New Testament scholar, found, and as we later discovered as we researched first century customs, it was allowed by the Mishnah to put a chin band, something around the face and over the head, to bind up the jaw against the effects of rigor mortis. And as John said,
and St. John also speaks of a napkin or sweat cloth or handkerchief that was over his head, or earlier described as round the face of Lazarus. And I think this is clearly functional. It was, as I understand it, a piece of cloth rather like this, which was then simply folded rather like a triangular bandage and made into a chin band, which would have been functionally necessary before rigor mortis set in, to bind up the jaw in this sort of manner and tie over the top of the crown.
there is, of course, much more. to the scriptural evidence. But we certainly don't have time to cover each and every facet of the shroud at this point. Suffice it to say that in every case where the shroud has been matched with